Hey there, nonfiction author who aspires to be traditionally published. All right, this is the video that I'm doing specifically for you about the citation tracking spreadsheet and how I approach working with authors who aspire to be traditionally published. And I hope that you've watched the overview, read the blog post, and done some research. I'm not going to go into the backstory here. Okay, there are different styles within Chicago Manual of Style and the way that the industry does things when they go to cite sources. And I always like to, as a developmental editor, being the main thing that I do, always keeping the reader's experience in mind. Now, well, there's two things. Always with the reader's experience in mind, and then when not with nonfiction, the risk management aspect of it. And that's where I say watch the overview, and I will refer you to some resources, an attorney who can help you with that, because I am not an attorney, and so I'm not even going to touch that and speak to that. All right, so let's just talk about the reader and why it's important to track your sources and some different options that you have. And first, when I am working with a nonfiction author that aspires to be traditionally published, I always recommend that they overdo when it comes to documentation, because I'm not privy to the style guide that these different publishers might have. And the way that I see myself is kind of a bridge and helping the author position themselves in the best way possible to move forward. And I'm assuming here that the writing must be tight. The topic must be timely. It must have broad appeal. You must have your platform in place. You must have a well-defined audience. I'm not even talking about any of that stuff. That's a given in this conversation. So I'm just talking about how I'm going to help those authors to make it easier on their publisher and present themselves as the most professional that they can. Okay, so that's why we're going to document. Let's talk about from a reader perspective. Now, I love nonfiction. I love fiction too, but nonfiction, just love it. I particularly like academic type of reading, and so I pulled a few books from my personal library, all of them nonfiction, and all of them happen to be published by Norton. So from a reader's perspective, my degree is in anthropology, love primatology, all of those kinds of things. So I read a lot about that. Frans de Waal, he's a primatologist, happens to be one of my favorites. What I love about de Waal is that his books are heavily researched and cited, and I find them very intellectually stimulating. And because I have other books in this genre and on this related topics, I like to map information in my mind. Many nonfiction readers are going to do the same thing. So whenever I read a book by de Waal, it's wonderful because if he introduces a different researcher or maybe a philosopher or something like that in his work, that my brain goes, oh, that's really interesting. Or it reminds me of another book I've read, and I start to piece different concepts together and do that kind of thing. It's fascinating to me, and it makes me want to then research and read the work of that person that was cited. And de Waal always is great about citing his sources, and really I'm sure a lot of that has to do with his publishers being very on the ball about that and demanding excellence in that way. So for me, it's great when the sources are cited properly and easily, in a way that's easy for me to look back at the back or in the end notes and go, okay, great, I need to buy such and such a book to read more about that. And it was published in this year, this is the title, this is the author. I call my local bookstore, I order the book. It's really easy for me. So that's why the end user, keeping your reader in mind and citing things properly, it's really respectful to your reader. And the other thing is that sometimes, not with DeWall, but I've read other books that something will be cited and I will either know about the author or the source that's being cited, or just something doesn't seem right. And I'll think, I think that's out of context. If it's cited properly, that allows your reader to go back and verify whether or not something was taken out of context. And if that was truly the original author or the original source, if that was their intent. Because as we all know, you can take a phrase or a sentence out of context and stick it somewhere else and present it in a way that's the exact opposite meaning of what the author or the original source had in mind. And again, this is a way for readers to cross-reference and answer questions in their mind of, hey, is this being quoted out of context? Now, hopefully you're not doing that, but if you aren't and the reader verifies that, it's a way for them to test your assertions. And if they go back to all these sources and sure enough, you're quoting things in context and you've built a proper case, that just solidifies you and your position in your reader's mind. So it's a win-win. Now, for different types of books, there is the Chicago Manual of Style, which is the publishing industry standard, and it requires certain pieces of information in the citation, for the citation. However, there are kind of sub-styles in that. And I pulled these 3 books from my personal library. They're all published by Norton. And what's interesting about them is you might think that Norton would always do things exactly the same, that their style guide would dictate that this is how we treat things. But they don't. And part of the reason for that, well, I don't know what the reason for that is. I'm extrapolating and thinking about this in a way that makes sense to me. Now, this one is in text citations, meaning that whenever the author references a source, at the end of the sentence in parentheses is the author's last name and the date that that particular book or article or whatever, DVD, documentary, was published. So then it's very easy for the reader to just flip back into the resources section, find that last name, then they have the information. This is probably what you're more familiar with in text citations if you're coming out of an academic background. I like this because it's very easy for the reader. They have immediately the information that they need. The downside to this is that that it takes up some space. And you know what? I'm not even going to talk about that right now. I'm going to gloss over that because that's just one way to do it, okay? All right, the next way to do it is like this book, and this one has footnotes. And you've probably seen books that do that. When something is referenced, at the very bottom of the page is a reference to the source, and oftentimes you will see additional information. I love footnotes because I like all the extra information, and if you like reading nonfiction essays, David Foster Wallace is the king of the footnote, and sometimes half of his pages could be footnotes, but that's a different style. But you may have seen that. It's nice because you immediately have the information that you want, but it pulls you out of the text to do that. Now in this one, endnotes, they used endnotes. So when there's a sentence or quote, something that's cited, at the end of that sentence is a superscript with a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then in the back matter, there is a section called notes, and it's broken out by chapter, and then there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you get, like you would with footnotes, the additional information. But you might still, for example, the quote in the chapter 1 is a Friedrich Nietzsche quote, and in the notes section, it just says Friedrich Nietzsche, 1889, page 5. Well, that's great, but I still don't know, because when I looked at this, I've got one of Nietzsche's books, and I thought, oh, I wonder if that's the book. But I couldn't tell right away, so I had to go to the resources page, or pages, and find Nietzsche, and then I saw that, oh, it's on the genealogy of morality and other writings, and when it was published, the publisher, the date, and all that. So that's when I could say, oh, that's not the book that I have. I would need to go and buy that book. So you can see that this one has a little bit of a couple different steps. But the beauty of this is that it's very orderly and it doesn't pull you out of the text when you're reading it. So it really just depends on your reader, what matches the style of your book best, what you're trying to accomplish, and what your reader's expectation is. So those are things that you can discuss with your editor or your literary agent, and how you should present those things. But again, from an editor who's working on the front end before you would send it, or sometimes in combination with a literary agent or something like that, but typically before you're going to send it to them, I'm really going to recommend that you have it as detailed as possible, and we'll talk about how we might do that for your particular book. But my point being that you can see that even though they follow the Chicago Manual of Style in that all of the information is there in the resources section, that the way that it plays out on the page is slightly different, and that they are taking each book and the purpose and the audience of each book into consideration when they make those decisions. Nothing is cookie cutter, nothing is cut and dry, and you have to think about things do a critical analysis of all the factors involved before making some of these decisions. But I do recommend, if you aspire to be traditionally published, to work with somebody who can really lock these things in and make it easier for the next person, and present yourself in the most professional light possible to help them make a determination as to whether or not you're somebody that is worth working with and would be a good long-term partner for them. All right, if you have questions, put them in the comments below, send me an email, schedule a consultation. I'm happy to talk to you and answer any questions that you might have.